Welcome back to Passionate Oral Talk Radio, a wholly owned subsidiary of Global Media Network, LLC. Our motto is and always will be educate, enlighten, and entertain. And one other thing before we start with Lisa Skinner, this is Memorial Day weekend, and I would like everyone to remember not just the white civilization who is celebrating their fallen heroes. I also dedicate this show to all the indigenous/Native American Indians who have lost their sons, fathers, husbands, parents, grandparents in the wars between them and the United States federal government. We will start the show with Lisa Skinner.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here. Got some great information to share with you today. I am going to start off by telling you that about 22% of our country's 5.2 million Native Americans live on tribal lands. This is according to the 2010 U.S. Census. The living conditions on the reservations have been cited as comparable to third world. That was a quote by the Gallup Independent on May 4th, 2004. It is impossible to describe the many factors that have contributed to the challenges that Native Americans face today. But the following facts about the most pressing issues regarding economics, health, and housing will give you a hint and a real look inside what life is like for many of our first Americans. So in regard to employment, typically tribal and federal governments are the largest employers on the reservations. Many households are overcrowded and only earn Social Security, disability, or veterans income. The scarcity of jobs and lack of economic opportunity means that, depending on the reservation now, 4 to 8 out of 10 adults on reservations are unemployed. Among American Indians who are employed, many are earning below poverty wages. That was cited to us by the American Indian Population and Labor Force Report in 2005. The overall percentage of American Indians living below the federal poverty line is 28.2%. The disparity for American Indians living below poverty on the reservations is even greater than that number, reaching 38% to 63% in our service area. That's a quote from 2006 from the National Center for Education Statistics and other sources. Often, heads of households are forced to leave the reservation to seek work, and grandparents take on the role of raising their children. In order to survive, extended families pool their meager resources as a way to meet just their very basic needs. The relative poverty still experienced in these blended families is best understood as the gap between the overall need and the need that goes unmet. Their housing situation. There is a dire housing crisis in Indian country. Despite the Indian Housing Authority's recent efforts, the need for adequate housing on reservations remains acute. One legislator deplored the fact that there are 90,000 homeless or underhoused Indian families, and that 30% of Indian housing is overcrowded and less than 50% of it's connected to a public sewer. In addition, many American Indians are living in substandard housing, About 40% of on-reservation housing is considered inadequate. The waiting list for tribal housing is long. The wait is often 3 years or more. And overcrowding is inevitable. Most families will not turn away any of their family members or anyone who needs a place to stay. It is not uncommon for 3 or more generations to live in a 2-bedroom home with inadequate plumbing, kitchen facilities, cooling, and heating. Further increasing the concerns with reservation housing is the noticeable absence of utilities. While most Americans take running water, telephones, and electricity for granted, many reservation families live without these amenities. On a seriously stretched budget, utilities are viewed as luxuries to these people compared to food and transportation. Overcrowding, substandard dwellings, and lack of utilities all increase the potential for health risks, especially in rural and remote areas where there is a lack of accessible health care. We're going to talk about their health. The average life expectancy of Native Americans has improved, yet still trails that of other Americans by almost 5 years. About 55% of American Indians rely on the Indian Health Service for medical care. Yet, the Indian Health Care Improvement Act only meets about 60% of their health needs. Due to underfunding, Indian health service facilities are crisis-driven and leave a wide gap in inadequate and preventative health care for many Native Americans on the reservations. Pharmacies and doctors' offices outside of hospitals are completely non-existent to some of these communities. The pressure to shift a traditional way of life toward a Western lifestyle has dramatically impacted the health and welfare of Native American peoples and created a terrible epidemic of chronic diseases such as diabetes, heart disease, tuberculosis, and cancer. These statistics are alarming. Heart disease is the leading cause of death for American Indians. Due to the link between heart disease, diabetes, poverty, and quality of nutrition and health care, 36% of natives with heart disease will die before the age of 65. Compared to 15% of Caucasians. American Indians are 177% more likely to die from diabetes than the Caucasian counterparts. 500% are more likely to die from tuberculosis. We don't even hear about tuberculosis, and they are 177% more likely to 500% more likely to die from it. 82% are more likely to die from suicide. Cancer rates and disparities related to cancer treatment are higher than for other Americans. And infant death rates are 60% higher than they are for Caucasian babies. The facts presented are important realities that we need to be aware of about the living conditions faced by many Native Americans in this country. And these are facts that every non-Native American needs to know, but most are not even aware of. For many people, this is a challenging gap between the person they are and the person they want to be or feel called to be. This tension is most obvious in people and communities with self-destructive behaviors. On one hand, there is a genuine desire for change, responsibility, and improvement. But on the other hand, there are patterns of relating, thinking, and behaving that seem nearly impossible to break. There are also major social and cultural barriers for them to overcome. It's no secret that Native American communities on many reservations may face big challenges such as addiction, abuse, poor health outcomes, lack of access to quality education, widespread unemployment, poor mental health, and much, much more. Recent scientific advances in the study of epigenetics and psychology show more and more clearly how traumatic experiences have shaped the lives of not only the people who experience them, but also their children and their children's children. Dr. Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart defines historical trauma as the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over one's lifetime and from a generation to generation following loss of lives, land, and vital aspects of culture. For Native American tribes, land is and always has been their identity. Based on the definition of epigenetics, many researchers, sociologists, and psychologists have discussed this new ideology called historical trauma as a central experience for marginalized groups like Native Americans, as well as the Jewish people and others. And we have talked about that extensively in our other episodes. Dr. Braveheart and other researchers' work suggests that historical trauma is lived out and experienced again and again in each subsequent generation, even if the generation is far removed from the original trauma. The results from one study suggest that daily thoughts about loss, stress, grief, discrimination, and cultural displacement pervade the lives of most Native Americans. Generations of Native Americans live under the shadow of their history, and this causes enormous stress on their bodies and their minds. For people who repeatedly experience loss, sorrow, difficult family settings, addiction, or destructive behavior, it can be liberating to realize that their struggles are not purely the result of their own choices or flaws. This is important, but may be connected to historical and cultural patterns of discrimination and trauma. And this is the information that is coming out in this work from Dr. Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart. Hopefully, this realization will empower people to understand where they have come from in order to heal and then choose a new path of personal freedom, peace, and hope. Today, the Native American challenges in the modern world are as follows. Native Americans today face some extraordinary challenges by nearly every social, cultural, economical, and physical measure. Native American communities and families are uniquely and negatively impacted by patterns of struggle, as we've just shared. While it is important to be positive and hopeful about the future life for Native Americans in this country, it is first important to have a genuine understanding of what Indigenous people face collectively as well as individually. To understand what Native American life is like today, we first have to understand what it used to be like for them. For the past 500 years, Native Americans have faced genocide, dislocation, and various forms of physical, mental, and social abuse. These factors have led to high rates of violence, assault, suicide, poverty, and abuse among the Native American peoples today. We have to understand the historical destruction that has occurred and how this destruction continues to feed the overwhelming hopelessness experienced by many Native Americans in the 21st century. Understanding Native American life and culture today means understanding their historical context and how it continues to impact the lives of Natives and their families. But unfortunately and sadly, the voices of Native Americans are largely unheard. In order to understand why Native Americans as a group have struggled to thrive in the modern world, it is also crucial to understand the importance of this historical trauma. Dr. Yellow Horse Braveheart is a Oglala Lakota and a professor at the University of New Mexico. She is the first person to develop the theory of historical unresolved grief. And she describes historical trauma as the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over one's lifetime from generation to generation following the loss of lives, land, and vital aspects of culture. The indigenous peoples of this continent have faced 500 years of genocide, dislocation, and variations of physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual violence. From the biological warfare through the introduction of Western diseases, the dislocation and violence of European expansion across the continent, the cruel and discriminatory policies of the 19th century that banned cultural and spiritual expressions of Native life and that forcibly removed Native children from their tribal homes and sent them to faraway boarding schools, to the discrimination and ignorance that continues to persist today. Native Americans are dealing with generations of collective group traumas. This massive trauma expresses itself today in the form of high rates of addiction, violence, and sexual abuse within Native American families and communities. Many accounts suggest that the boarding school generations that we talked about 2 episodes ago, in particular, were permanently scarred by their loss of identity and experiences of physical, mental, and sexual abuse in their school system. When these Native children returned to their homes and family, having lost their culture and identity, and began to have families of their own, sadly, they were unable to form healthy bonds and passed on these patterns of abuse to their own children, creating cycles of broken families. There is scientific evidence to support the idea that this kind of trauma gets passed down on the cellular level. Recent studies in the field of epigenetics suggest that gestation and affects the child's likelihood of developing mental and physical diseases and the child's ability to regulate and manage stress throughout their lives. Native Americans today do not need to see themselves as permanent victims of history. Don't get us wrong about that. But understanding the roots of historical trauma and seeing the way ancestral wounds have impacted today's community is definitely an important first step to healing and to growth. Today, only 65% of Native students graduate from high school, the lowest graduation rate among all American students. This lack of educational opportunity for Native Americans is a serious challenge, one that impacts the success and health of Native communities in the long term. Because of the reality of poverty on most reservations, many Native American children attend underfunded schools. Even the federal government's impact aid program, which is in place to serve underprivileged children, is far from adequate. There are many private institutions that are working hard to provide affordable, quality education for Native American children, such as St. Joseph's Indian School and Red Cloud Indian School. However, the problem persists. Without proper funding, the education system is simply insufficient. No other way to explain it. And poor education, statistically speaking, leads to violence, poverty, and health-related issues. At the root of many of the health, education, economic, and cultural changes faced by Native American is tension over economic opportunity and property rights, specifically over tribal lands. This was really eye-opening, what I'm going to share with you now. The tension over Native American property ownership has deep historical roots. Existing policy has established a relationship between tribal nations and the federal government that is characterized as a federal trust. The federal government assumes all responsibility for the management of Indian lands, acting as the legal ownership or trustee on behalf of the tribal nations with which it has established treaty. The federal trust relationship is driven by the idea that tribal nations are not capable of administrating or managing their own lands. Without the right to own or manage their own lands, tribes are handicapped from economic activity and development and left out of very important conversations like the recent controversy surrounding the Dakota Access Pipeline. As one Atlantic article explaining this situation puts it, Indians have long suffered from what the Nobel Prize-winning economist Hernando de Soto has called dead capital. They may possess a certain amount of land on paper, but they can't put it to use by selling it, buying more to take advantage of economies of scale, or borrowing against it. They are prohibited from it. Many tribes have close ties to the land on which they live. Even if the current footprint of land is much smaller than what they had in their original regions, many of the tribes might not choose to develop their tribal lands or leverage their rich natural resources because of a desire to preserve and maintain the integrity of their sacred spaces. However, they are unable to make free choices about how to conduct their economic affairs and are not given a full voice in the decisions surrounding sacred lands due to the severely restricted property rights from the federal government. Native American tribes desperately need access to wealth and resources that rightfully belong to them. Unfortunately, the high levels of crime and violence have led to an epidemic of missing and murdered Native American women in the United States. I did not know this.
I did.
You did, Lillian?
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually think you mentioned this before.
They have the largest capital of women being abused, as well as their daughters, but kidnapped and sold into the international women rings for prostitution, slavery overseas. And because of this, there is no laws protecting them.
That's right. According to the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women, 4 out of 5 Native women are affected by violence today, and American Indian women face murder rates that are more than 10 times the national average.
They don't have the capital to go out. And when the Indian police go out, they don't have the resources to really do a good job. So when they don't find them within a day or two, they have to cease and desist because they don't have the natural resources that most small towns now possess in order to go out and track down missing kids, especially girls or women. Women you can see a lady in the morning, and by afternoon, when she's supposed to come home from work or school or wherever she's supposed to be, she doesn't come home. And there's nothing. Literally, these people's hands are tied.
That's exactly what we're uncovering here. The history of violence against Native American women does date back centuries to the first explorers of North America and has continued through the settlement and expansion by Europeans over the centuries. Native American women have always been throughout history targeted for abuse and slavery.
A lot of the problem is, of course, comes from how the tribes have set up their system, whereby women were not only considered property, but they were considered as same as the whites for childbearing and taking care of the home. So, like in China, if a trader was living in the mountains out in the West and he wanted a wife, he knew he can go in with a couple of whiskey bottles, some trade beads, and a blanket, or a horse, and exchange that for a wife.
And that blanket might have even had smallpox infested in it. That is throughout history how we spread our diseases.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, Ed, well, I'll comment further later.
Okay. Human trafficking in Native American communities is another epidemic that continues every day, just like Lillian said. Because of the rural areas where Natives live and the lack of law enforcement available, Native women have been an easy target for violence and trafficking. Additionally, there are complicated jurisdictional barriers, exactly what she shared with us, that arise when a crime occurs between Native and non-Native peoples that often lead to injustice. Massive events like the Sturgis Motorcycle Rally, for example, become hotspots for Native American trafficking, with multiple arrests being made every year. Unfortunately, law enforcement and government officials are becoming increasingly aware of the issue and taking steps to address it, but we still have a long, long way to go to protect Indigenous women from sexual violence and trafficking. This is happening today. All of these current challenges, lack of educational opportunity, physical and mental health disparities, the intense impact of historical trauma, lack of economic independence, are all part of the great tragedy still facing Native Americans today, the loss of Native American culture and their identities. The traditional ways of life, the tribal languages, the songs and dances, the wisdom of elders, and the strong values that once animated Native cultures have in many cases been threatened or even extinguished completely. Even for the tribes who have managed to recover or maintain a strong sense of their cultural heritage, there is still the present difficulty of understanding how tribal identity can coexist with the modern Western culture, which opposes it in so many ways. Part of the challenge is that Native Americans are a diverse and scattered race of people. There are currently 6.7 million Native Americans living in the United States. However, as I mentioned before, only 22% of Native Americans live on their reservations. The rest are scattered across the country. For people of Native American descent who live off the reservations, the challenge is to see what their Native American identity and ancestry means for their lives. In many cases, people of Native American descent are full of a longing to know more about their ancestors and to reconnect with a tribe and the culture that they have so unfortunately lost. Many young Native Americans, like Star Chief Eagle, are keeping their culture alive and sharing it with the world. Star practices hoop dancing, art, language, history, and song to keep her native Lakota tradition alive by performing for visitors at schools, reservations, and national parks. Star and others like her are fighting these challenges and bringing energy and hope to their people. Dennis Metcalf of the Hunkpati Oyata tribe is turning trauma and difficulties into healing through art. With all of these challenges facing Native American communities, it is no small task trying to keep the Native identity alive. Many young tribal members are struggling with identity crisis and feel removed from their Native heritage. Can't imagine why. However, the message that people like Star Chief Eagle and Dennis Metcalf are sending is very clear. The Native American identity is something to be proud of, and it's worth preserving. Today, Native art is among the most beautiful in the world, with incredible paintings, books that tell amazing stories, and dancing that invokes thousands of years of ancestral history. Visiting reservations and museums, you can see the spirit of Native American culture being kept alive. Even now, tribes across the country are still practicing the customs and traditions that have existed for centuries, including their spiritual beliefs, their clothing and appearance, food, song, and dance, and more. America, across the country, there are signs of hope transforming the lives of Native Americans. A new wave of Native voices is rising up and claiming back their own stories and the stories of their ancestors. This new wave of leadership, hope, and healing is centered around the sharing of powerful stories. Why storytelling? Because telling stories of Native struggle and Native strength has always been a powerful catalyst for unity, generational healing, and personal growth for the Native American culture. Experts like Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who study the impact of historical trauma on Native Americans, also talks about the process of moving forward from this historical grief. First is confronting the historical trauma, she says. Second is understanding the trauma. Third is releasing the pain of this historical trauma. And fourth is then transcending the trauma. In this new season of hope, Native people are working through the process of confronting, understanding, and releasing the pain that they, their parents, and their grandparents have all carried forth in the last 500 years. And they are doing it by sharing stories about where they are coming from and where they hope to be in the future. This sharing of stories is a rediscovery of what it means to be Native in the 21st century, using new tools and for connection and powerful digital media. Native people are honoring the old oral traditions of Indigenous peoples and breaking down the barriers to healing through their storytelling. This new effort to share Native stories invites both Natives and non-Natives into a process of listening, learning, empathizing, and reflecting on the lives of journeys of others. So we all have a role to play in helping this culture heal. And I want to direct you to the website that I found this information on. It's called Native Hope. And you can find them at www.hope@nativehope.org. And it is a fascinating website filled with the information. This wasn't all the information. I just took bits and pieces to highlight the lives, the status of their lives today. It's a phenomenally resourceful site. So I would encourage you to visit it and find out more about the life of Native Americans today. Thank you for listening. And I'm going to turn the mic over to Betsy and Lillian. Maybe we can have a little bit of discussion about what their thoughts are on this ideology that what we're seeing today with Native American cultures has been passed down from generation to generation. They have been traumatized for so many years that they really can't help that they haven't been able to move forward more than they have as we see it today.
Okay, well, I'm going to jump in and then we'll have Betsy jumping in as well. I think that our history keeps on repeating itself. And when you look at our own current economic, political, and yes, drama from history, you can see it among what the church in Rome has done to the rest of the world in terms of what they decided would be the standard in which all other civilizations will follow. Unfortunately, you may not think that, but religion and government always seem to have a hand and walk down the aisle together. A lot of the arrogance, a lot of the beliefs and conviction that God is on our side and not on the other side. We know who's on the other side, and it's not God. They have the right to plunder, to rape, to burn, to kill, because they did not believe in what that church, that ideology stood for. If you look at Hitler or Rome or even Alexander the Great, what was the first thing they did when they spread out to conquer the world? Is that they take the children away from the parents and send them somewhere else to be taught to what they think is right, irregardless of whatever culture and society these kids came from. Next, they attacked the women. And every single episode that you study on war between cultures and countries, the women are always targeted every single time. They're either raped, they're enslaved, or they're abused. Hasn't changed. Doesn't matter whether it's the indigenous Indians or the Aztecs or the Mayans or the Indians who live in South America or the so-called savages that live out on the islands in the Mediterranean or the Caribbean. It didn't matter. The white man felt like he had the power the control, and the right to do what they wanted to do, which makes me very afraid for how we're looking and going into space and settling on those planets that they deem suitable to adjust for human living. And it's something to think about, ladies and gentlemen, is that have we learned as a civilization to be more humble, to be more sympathetic? And the best one would be empathy towards our fellow man. But it's real easy when you look at another person and say, well, he's not human. He's a savage. And that has not changed. And I don't care what culture you look at, whether it's the Japanese or the Chinese or the Indo-Chinese or from Africa, take a good, hard look at the 21st century and take a look at the history we are now creating. And while you're at it, go take a look at some of the Republicans who are running for office and read how they're going to clean up history to their version of what history should be, which means your children will never learn the truth of what history is because these people want to, quote, whitewash it, unquote. Betsy?
Hi. Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Lisa, for such great, wonderful information that, wow, I'm sitting here, my mind is spinning with all this information, and it's mind-boggling. Is the only way I can put it, of how in America this can go on. And I was thinking back to it probably was those 60s, maybe early 70s, but I think more the 60s. I remember seeing a commercial, or it might have been a public service announcement, of a Native Americans living on the reservation. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I remember seeing like little shack, and they didn't have any running water. Don't remember what exactly it was about, but that's in the 60s that they were showing the reservations looking like this. So apparently it hasn't changed in 50 years. And that's pretty sad. And I, thinking back to, I'm dating myself here, to the late 60s, could have been early 70s, Paul Revere and the Raiders sang a song honoring the Cherokee people. If I could find the video link, I will put it in the blog for people to listen to, because even back then, they were talking about the Cherokee people, their what they would make getting now made in China. You're talking about the 60s, folks, and how they took away their land. Seems like nothing's changed. And I always, it always bothered me and always boggled my mind as to why people think they're better than others. I don't know. If you have an answer, you could tell me, because I like to know why people of certain origins, like going back to Germany and what they were teaching for generations about all different cultures, why do they think they're better? Why does the Aryan Nation or the Ku Klux Klan, probably going to get hate mail or threats now, think they're better than other people? I don't get it. And there is a very, this is what I looked up, I think on Wikipedia, that, my notes here, there are 326 Indian reservations left. And there, as what Lisa was saying, substance abuse, addiction is a big problem. The largest population, I believe, is the Navajo people. This shouldn't, how we treated the Native Americans shouldn't have been, but it's a greed. It's pure greed. Why don't the Native Americans have charge over their land? Why is it still the federal government taking control in this day and age of 2023? And why don't they have the same opportunities? And when Lisa was talking about historical trauma that is going on in many different cultures, and even in Newark, New Jersey, and I just did a story interview about that. The riots in Newark. Generations are still suffering from that. Matter of fact, the Newark mayor, Baraka, his dad was beaten up during the 1967 riots. There was no justice done. 26 people were murdered, and there was no justice.
And it looked like the bomb had exploded down there.
Yeah.
And the current mayor rode around in a Sherman tank. I lived about 5-10 miles away from Newark, and you just didn't go in there. It was a war zone.
Yes, yes, it was. And I wish I had answers. And I know I say this repeatedly, and I'm going to sound redundant, but I'm going to say it again. We all want the same things, all of us. So why can't we just put aside differences and to learn to have our humanity back and our brotherhood for each other and just help each other instead of destroying each other? To me, there's no reason for it. This has nothing to do with the Native Americans, but when I was in high school, I was 16, 17, I worked in a nursing home, and I liked an African American guy that worked there, but that was not allowed. You didn't even think about interracial dating back in the 70s. My father would have killed me. And the woman that worked with me, she was from West Virginia. So you have to think back. This is 1974 or 75. She was a lot older, probably in her 40s or 50s. And where she grew up, I won't even use the language she used, but she told my mother that I was talking to an African American guy, but she didn't use those words. And it's really a shame, and when Lisa was talking about it and Lillian were talking about the Native American women and the sex trade, I want to pose another question. Why is it that when someone who's of a different skin color, or the Native Americans, or it could be African American, Hispanic, how come there's not the big press about those women or girls missing? Why is it the white people, Caucasian, and I'm Caucasian, but why is it all the press for the Caucasian people that are missing? Don't the Black people, African Americans, and people of color, don't they count too when they go missing? Don't you think their loved ones want to find them alive or dead just to have closure? We have to really change, folks. We really do, because we're just going on a downward spiral. And I just want to say this Memorial weekend, think about what it really means. Freedom comes with a price. And I just want to remember the brave men and women who died fighting for this country, to the Native Americans who died, unfortunately, at the hands of Caucasians. And, it's greed. People want property. People want gold. They want this. They want that. And they think they have a right to get it, even if it's on someone else's property. And, even what's it called? Eminent domain. That's even here in New Jersey, where the developer wants your house. You don't have much of a choice. So that's going on. And that's all I have to say. Thank you for listening. And if you want to respond to any of my questions, my email is Sloan, SLOAN, Betsy, BETSY, 31@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and have a happy and safe Memorial Day.
I think one of the most egregious things that have come out of today's episode and is really through this research and uncovering this information that we've shared with you today, really kind of hits you between the eyes, because it really demonstrates and proves that even though our whole show is about atrocities that have happened throughout history, and we've talked about the Holocaust, and we've talked about Japanese internment camps, and we've talked about human trafficking, and this series is all about the Native Americans. As I was uncovering this information, I couldn't help but think how all of these cultures who have been targeted, Chinese, Japanese, it's just the list goes on and on. But in this case, to me, it seems like this one particular culture has been held back more than any other culture in history. Others have made giant leaps forward, some more than others. But this one doesn't seem like they've been allowed to. I mean, we've had an African-American president. We have an African-American vice president. We have a lot of people of color and different cultures in politics, but we don't ever see that in the Native American culture. So this was definitely an eye-opening episode for me, and probably everybody else out there who never really was aware of any of the circumstances that has continued to hold this culture prisoner. And they're not moving forward at all. They're still living like they were, well, they have all along since we set foot on this land and took over. And I want to wish everybody a happy Memorial Weekend, and thanks for listening. I hope this.
Email.
Oh, my email is dementiawhisperer1@gmail.com. We appreciate you being here with us today very, very much.
And I want to add too that when you do your pledging to the United States of America, please remember that it's more than just the Europeans or the Chinese or the Asians who came over to this country. The indigenous people were here first. They certainly can trace them going across the Russia and then going up into Siberia and then coming down from the straits and the land that were still in formation down into what they considered the Americas, North and South America. So please keep it in mind that the blood that ran to protect you and your spouse and your children and grandchildren and your grandparents, the color is still red, and everybody has it. There's no differentiation between one person and the next. And my call to action for you is to remember that it takes a whole civilization to make a country, not one person with a military at his beck and call, but a whole nation of people. It's the diversity of that nation which makes that country strong, and you are part of that nation. And my other call to action is this: when you listen to our program, should you have any comments, opinions, whether you agree or disagree, please let us know, because the topics we discuss are topics, I'm not going to say trendy, but they're current, and they're not going to go away. In the United States, we still have a democracy of sorts, and you have all types of people who are politicians who have their opinions, beliefs, comments, and not all of them are going to help you and your family or your grandparents, because our capital, Washington, D.C., is very far from the reality of how the individuals in this country live. So please remember that. You can reach me at pwrnetworkllc@gmail.com. And although you only get to vote for a federal government every 4 years, state and city every 2 years, let me remind you of this. Broadcast media is the lifeline of any country, whether it is by radio, online radio, television. As long as you have a voice and you believe what you have to say is right, please speak up. Don't take it for granted that the civil rights you have today will be there for you tomorrow, or even there for your children and their children tomorrow. Civil rights are very fragile. Go ask the African Americans, go ask the Native American Indians, go ask the Jews. They will tell you. So don't take anything for granted. If you have something to say, let us know. Call us up, text us, contact us on Facebook, facebook.com/Passionate World Radio, twitter.com/PWTR. Not that difficult. Instagram.com/PWTR. You have a voice. Use it, because it may be silenced by those who fear what your voice will tell them. Thank you all very much for listening. You can hear and see this program, Lest We Forget, all over again on youtube.com/PWR network _PWTR. Also on https://passionateworldtalkradio.com. And to name a few, iTunes, iHeart, Spotify, Amazon Audible. Yes, you can listen to us. Spreaker.com. Talk to Alexa. She will get you there. So thank you. And if you're wondering what our next topic is, we're going to talk about the transgender community. In fact, there is a book that has just been published by Random House out of India about a lady who went on a journey. And it's her autobiography of how she started out and started her journey towards becoming someone else. And in the beginning, she was beaten and abused. And at the end of her journey, she received the highest honor a country can bestow on somebody who went from A to Z. And we will open our next program with her. So thank you very much. Have a good Memorial Day. But please remember why you have Memorial Day in the first place. It's just not an excuse to go down to the beach. Thank you.